Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today I just wanted to talk about the books that I've been reading this week, which is this lovely little bunch here. It's taken a very kind of LGBTQ angle this week. I mean, more than usual, but let's talk a little bit about some of the books I've been reading. First up, and I've got a separate video coming out on the entire Goldsmiths shortlist, but I read two from the shortlist this week. The first of which being Lori and Joe by Amy Arnold. And this is a really short little book, but really does quite a lot, I think, in its pages. So it follows this idea of this couple, Lori and Joe, as the name might suggest. And Lori wakes up one day to basically find that Joe has died. And her way of then processing the end of his life and therefore this sort of their relationship, and everything that happened within it, is to go on these long walks. And she starts doing this sort of walking around sort of the local countryside, and in doing so has all of these sorts of flashbacks or meditations on everything that's happening. But it's told in this very kind of almost conversational stream of consciousness sort of style. But what is happening within that, I think, is so fascinating, because she is able to pick out these really heartfelt, beautiful thoughts about love and relationships and companionship and so many other things in this really heartfelt and beautiful way. So I just really enjoyed this book, and I think it is sort of deceptive in its size. It's an incredibly meaningful, beautiful book, and I was so convinced by the way this story is told. There's something about the writing style that I just found completely engaging and beautiful, with all these sort of little funny asides as well about aspects of their relationship. So I just thought this was gorgeous, and I really enjoyed this. Similarly, on the same shortlist, we have Never Was by Gareth, Gavin. And this is a book that largely deals with a few kind of key characters as they sort of are very wedded to this sense of place. And I'm being vague a little bit about what happens within the story, because in many ways it's relatively meandering in quite a positive way, I think. It's a book that sort of really seeks to sort of tell parts of the history of this group of characters who are sort of these young people, and in doing so it also sort of adapts the page to sort of reference what is basically happening. So early on in the book, we have most of the story told in almost one-page sorts of chapters, and these are almost meant to be individual thoughts. So somebody will talk about something, then we'll go to the next page and we carry on the thought. So it isn't really a chapter in that sense. It's a little bit more of a kind of, the thought has ended here, now the character's going and thinking about this thing, and we come back here. Later on in the book, it sort of merges into more of a, let's find a really good example of this, into something a bit more like this, where the characters are talking kind of across the page, and these are sort of separate dialogues happening. So this is one character and then another. And what I think is, and obviously that's sort of a thing that it does and is playful in its own right, and at one point it completely blows this up. Let's find a good example from near the end, where the book just sort of devolves into really broken down bits of text, and these are all basically almost asterisks hit down here, where it talks a little bit about the code. And all of this is sort of a playful, fun thing about what you can do with language and with the page. But I think what's really interesting here is how that helps deliver a story about coming of age, and particularly coming of age when it comes to sort of trans non-binary identities as well. So there's something in here where we have a character called Finn, and for the vast majority of the book we have no idea what gender Finn is sort of identifies with, because there's almost no marker given. We don't have pronouns or any kind of reference. So we might occasionally have Finn touches Finn's face, for example, leaving out entirely what, not even a they here. And so this gets played with a lot throughout the book, but it's also a sort of deeper story of these kind of characters who really are trying to understand who they are, understand themselves within all of this, and often in a in sort of trans identity kind of terms as well. And so it's really fascinating what this book does. It wasn't always massively successful for me, but I think right towards the end, this book almost exits on this idea of having a separate section that almost casts the rest of this book as being sort of a meta thing within something else. And so I just really enjoyed the playfulness of this and how it almost kind of queers the idea of what a novel can be. On a related note, another book I read this week that was that sort of has some crossover with that last book is Eliot Duncan's Ponyboy, which I just sort of saw. I think I'd heard of a couple of people talking about, but I saw it when I was in a bookshop, and I just was like, sure, why not? Let's pick it up. And it's it's a little bit more of a kind of not necessarily Beat Generation, but if you imagine those sorts of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas kind of things, where the characters are almost entirely on drugs or drunk for a vast amount of the book, kind of that sort of vibe throughout. But a lot of, particularly a couple of characters trying to come to terms with their identities, again, about, especially around being trans. Our main character is sort of essentially testing out being a trans man. He's sort of burrowing little bits into finding out about his identity, but in the meantime he's got this incredibly convoluted and sort of complicated life where he is sort of constantly looking to either score drugs or drink or what have you, and his life is sort of this slightly chaotic thing, and so the book is sort of trying to piece that together. I think I found the second half of this book a little bit more successful. I think the first part I found a bit too I don't know, it felt like it was going for edgy with characters constantly being a little bit drunk or high or whatever. And actually, I think the later half of this book, where it really delves into deeper conversations around identity, I thought were far more beautiful and far more interesting. I still think it's an engaging book overall. I think it was just a bit of a book of two halves for me in that respect, but I think it still has a lot of good things as well. Next up, I read Pilcrow by Adam Mars Jones. And so Adam Mars Jones is an author who I've read a little bit of before, Box Hill being the book that I absolutely adored and was one of my top books of the year a few years back. And Pilcrow is one of a, currently a trilogy. It's sort of billed as this sort of semi-infinite series of novels. But essentially it focuses on a young boy called John Cromer, whose life in many ways involves him he's sort of on the outskirts of society in sort of several ways. So he is a young boy who, with sort of various medical issues, has to spend a lot of time in hospital. And so his life is him trying to kind of be a teenage boy, or be a young boy, whilst also sort of navigating just sort of being slightly cut off from a lot of the things that many other people his age would be out and about doing. But it's also a really kind of absurd book in many ways. It has a plot, but it's not really particularly focused on a plot. And so sort of 500 or so pages of this book, and we don't really get a massive amount of movement forward in a plot. But what we do get is these sort of very absurd, sort of very strange things all kind of happening. So he, for example, we learn a lot about his sort of nascent sexuality and his sort of him becoming a young man and sort of realizing that he is gay, all these other sort of elements to him. And we get all of these in these very sort of odd little asides. He often doesn't really understand a lot of what's going on in the world around him as well. So, you know, these big things will be happening and he'll ask his mother, like, but why do we think it's this? Why do we think this thing is happening? And we as readers can kind of read between the lines, or we kind of know vaguely what's happening. And he is just this he's sort of fairly oblivious to it all. It's quite a weird book. I mean, I'm sort of about halfway through the second book now, and they're odd. They are very odd, but really engaging. There's a real humor that goes through them. It's very funny and absurd and silly, and yeah, it's just a strange little book, but very fun in its own way as well. Next up, I read Mary Jean Chan's Bright Fear, a collection of poetry, and I adored her last collection, Flesh, which spoke a lot about desire and her relationship with her mother, and also kind of by default her relationship with Hong Kong, with the English language, with various other things as well. In many ways, some of those big themes appear again in Bright Fear, although this book engages a little bit more with the pandemic in some quite interesting ways, I think. She, for example, talks a lot about the ways that being from Hong Kong, you are often, at least for her age, she was often taught to sort of prioritize English and sort of idolize it as this sort of perfect tongue that you have to speak. And so there's this interesting tension in the collection, because she is very aware that she is writing in English, that there are kind of bits where she quotes her mother saying, you know, why do you have to write this in this language, or why do you have to do this in this way? And so there's a lot that comes in about sort of family and heritage and language in these really interesting and complicated ways. And that's one thing in and of itself. But as I mentioned, it also deals with the pandemic. And a big way that it deals with the pandemic is in sorts of the ways that we view things around isolation, for example. But I also think it goes a lot deeper. I think, you know, so many books have been written about the kind of the isolation that comes out of something like a pandemic, and that's not to be sort of scoffed at. Like, these are important conversations, and that was a very big part of it. But I think she's able to sort of look under the hood a little bit more. I get the sense that she's really investigating some of the wider things there. So she, for example, remembers a memory of being in Hong Kong during the SARS outbreak. So she talks about her father coming back. I mean, there's this really beautiful image of, you know, she talks about waiting for him to take off his mask so she can see the imprint of it, because there's something that sort of fascinates her about it. And there's something so tender and beautiful about her writing that I've enjoyed about this and her last collection, Flesh. But that's just so beautiful. She's so able to hold the kind of space on the page for certain emotions or feelings, but deliver them in very short, punchy ways that don't minimize the impact at all. I just think she's an incredible writer, and I really, really loved this collection. Next up, I read Hi Honey, I'm Homo by Matt Baume. And Matt Baume is a podcaster and YouTuber who I love anyway. He writes a lot and sort of creates a lot of content around pop culture, and particularly in terms of queer representation in media, and particularly how things like sitcoms often were a vehicle to explore quite complicated topics, or really help change minds of people who were uncertain about things. And this book, Hi Honey, I'm Homo, in many ways really picks up on a lot of those tropes. So he follows a lot of TV programs, from Golden Girls, Modern Family, a few others here and there as well, and really looks at how, you know, representations of queer characters sort of changed, and how actually that really impacted things. So he talks about Ellen DeGeneres with her show, and how some of that paved the way for things like Will and Grace. But also in doing so, he really investigates what was happening in US society at the time that informed or rubbed against various parts of this. So I just found it fascinating, because if nothing else, it's just a really good excuse to read or listen to some one-liners from Golden Girls and basically just remember how good that show is. But yeah, just a really interesting way. It's very well researched, it's very thoroughly done, but it has a lightness of touch where it feels like it kind of, it's able to bring out the joy whilst also really going deep into some of the issues around, for example, the use of a certain trope or a certain joke in sitcoms at certain times. So I really, really love this. It was just a warm hug of a book in many ways, whilst also being incredibly poignant and important in what it's saying more broadly as well. And to end on a very different note, I listened to two memoirs by famous socialites, or famous pop icons, I guess, of their time. And those were both Paris Hilton and Britney Spears. And although at first those sound both like they might be relatively light on content, I think just because from the public image that both of those women have had, It's actually quite interesting, I think, delving into something like their memoirs and finding out a bit more about what they have to say about the worlds they lived in. So for Paris Hilton, she is often viewed as this sort of airhead, and it's a character she played quite often. But there's something a bit deeper in what she is going into here. In her memoir, she talks a lot about ADHD, for example, which is not something I knew about her. And she talks about how her ADHD informed how she, large parts of her life. So that, for example, she was a slightly rebellious young child, or she would be going out quite a lot. And that led to some things I hadn't heard about for her at all. But when she was young, she was basically kidnapped by, her family basically arranged for her to be kidnapped and taken to this camp that was meant for troublesome teens, an incredibly expensive camp at that. It was very much targeted at the very rich. And a big part of what that was to sort of break these people down emotionally, to a point where they would be almost this sort of cult that were all informing on each other and all making sure that other people got in trouble instead of them, all to kind of try and correct some behavior. And it was only years later that her parents realized what had happened there. I think for a while they just didn't believe her. And so it's really interesting reading something like that about her. And on a very similar note, a book that has very much taken the internet by storm and the world by storm. The Woman in Me by Britney Spears. And this book in many ways deals with some of those similar things, but there's something very scary, I think, about kind of delving into parts of this, because we realize actually so much of the public persona of Britney has been a manufactured one. And in some ways that's not news, but what we find is going on behind it is something really profound and deep, that the conservatorship that we know a bit more about in recent years, and just the depths that the absolute hold that had on her life. So we learn quite early on in the book about various ways that being a media starlet and sort of this big pop icon really worked against her in some parts of her personal life. So having to do some really quite horrible, some really deal with some very tricky emotions in performing sort of home, in this case, a home abortion, to deal with this, because she couldn't go to a hospital, because to do so would mean that paparazzi could see her and might then run stories on her life. We learn a lot in the book about how the conservatorship affected her relationship with her kids, because she often stayed in the conservatorship, or didn't fight as hard as she could have, or she didn't resist as much as she maybe could have at times, because she was worried that would mean that her kids would be taken away from her. And so what we learn is just these layers upon layers of incredibly sad and horrible things that happened to her. But this book is sort of more about peace than retribution, and there's something quite beautiful about the way that ends, in looking to do that. I've spoken more broadly about the book in a separate video, but yeah, it's a lot. It's one of those ones that's a bit intense to sit and read. So yeah. Anyhow, on a different note, those have been the books that I read this week. This sort of pile plus those two memoirs. It's been an interesting reading week, and again, like I said, sort of lots of LGBTQ books, and not necessarily by accident. I mean, I sort of naturally gravitate a little bit towards them anyway, but it's just sort of fun, the kind of overlaps that we've had with reading this week. Anyway, I've been Bod the Booker. Take care, and I hope you have a great week. Bye bye.